Welcome back to another video. Today I'm looking at the Sony A100 DSLR camera. This is Sony's first DSLR. They took over from Konica Minolta with A mount. And you'll probably notice this looks quite familiar in terms of the body design to the Dynax 5D, which I looked at not too long ago. On the left hand side we have the function dial. There's quite a few different settings on that. We're still using the inverted Minolta hot shoe on this model. Moving on to the right hand side we have the main mode dial, and here we can see some differences between this and the 5D. We just have the drive button there, and this does include the mirror lockup. That was something which was missing from the A200 that I recently reviewed. They have put the power input on the left hand side instead of the back. That's another change from the 5D. They have a more durable plastic cover on this versus the rubber. On the flash we have a manual pull-up system, which I'm quite okay with. There's no buttons or anything like that, so you just pull it up when you want to use it, and it does support wireless flash too. Take a look at the back now. You can see the buttons on the left hand side. They did make the menu button a bit larger, and that's a welcome change. There's the sensors there for the eyepiece, so that will turn off the back LCD. There we have the D-pad, directional pad, the remote input port, and there is a switch there for the steady shot. A couple of buttons at the top, your exposure compensation and auto exposure lock, and they double up for image review as well. Compact flash, it takes the type 1 and the type 2. Port on the left hand side, that's for the audio visual output. Originally you did get a cable with this so you could plug it into a TV. Probably not going to be much use to you now. Do note that the compact flash card goes label facing away from you. Looking at the battery now, originally this came with the NP-FM55H, but you can also use the FM500H, but the problem is you can't use the 55H with the later cameras, and there is no info lithium display on this camera. Onto the front of the body, they have added their sort of orange effect with the alpha around the lens mount. There's your depth of field preview button. The grip material on this camera is quite different to the 5D. It's more of a sort of flexible plasticky type material. It's still fairly good in terms of the overall feel and grip with the camera. We'll have a listen now to the shutter sound and the buffer. Pretty noticeable slap off of that shutter, though you do have a decent sized buffer with this camera. iStar AF is very similar to the A200. It uses those sensors, and personally I just turn it off. I don't find it particularly useful. Many features have been carried over from the 5D, including the rotating display on the back, so it has the sensor there. It detects when it's being turned around. You also get the choice of a larger or smaller display. As far as the menus now, we'll take a quick look through those, and they are basically pretty much the same as the 5D. You will notice that the resolution is much improved over the earlier model. Obviously it's not as good as modern LCDs, but it's perfectly usable. And the menus are straightforward enough. There's nothing too complicated about those. Regarding the function dial, there are quite a few settings on that now. What Sony did is they moved the functions across from the button on the 5D over to that dial. If you remember on the 5D review that I did, it was dedicated to the white balance settings and just that alone. In a lot of ways that is an improvement, but possibly there's an argument for maybe they could have kept that function button and possibly put a couple of different settings in there for a quick access. It's hard to know how much of the A100 is Minolta and how much is Sony. I imagine quite a bit of it was already in progress when Sony took over from Konica Minolta. Let's take a look at the image quality with this camera, and you'll notice that even at ISO 400 there is a bit of noise there showing up. It's not too bad, but perhaps a bit more than you might expect, and that increases quite a bit when you get to 800. Top setting of 1600 is quite noisy in terms of luminance and color noise. But if I shade the JPEGs, there's a very significant difference between 800 and 1600. 1600 has a lot less saturation in the image. Sometimes you can also see a bit of banding in there as well. So 1600 on this camera, it's not a great setting really. This was the original dynamic range optimizer that Sony came out with, and it works reasonably well most of the time, but sometimes the effect can be quite subtle, other times it can be more dramatic. Unlike some of the later or higher end cameras, we don't have a manual setting for the DRO, but they did carry over the zone matching settings from the 5D, and that means we have the low ISO 80 and the high ISO 200. And that makes quite a big difference to the images. I personally find it more useful than the dynamic range optimizer. This makes quite a difference to the raw files, unlike the DRO, which is just JPEG. 80 is more for the shadows, and the high mode for 200 is for highlights. And real world, you can see outside, particularly with a shot like this, very difficult shot for this camera with limited dynamic range. Particularly if you're going to be shooting raw and processing the images, it does give you quite a bit more headroom in terms of the highlight recovery. Though it does mean to say that your images are somewhat underexposed when you bring them into the raw processor. If you find there's a respectable magnification, it's a penta mirror rather than a prism. It's perhaps slightly better than many of its competitors in the day. As with the other two cameras that I reviewed, we don't have a full-time ISO display. That only turns up when you press the button. Sony increased the metering to 40 segments, and overall it's fairly good, but sometimes it can underexpose a bit, so do keep an eye on that. Give you a few of my thoughts on the image quality with the camera. This has quite a different look to the A200 and 5D as far as the JPEGs go. The auto white balance can be a bit on the cool side. I would say that the images out of camera are quite natural or neutral in comparison to the 5D and even the A200. Both of those cameras I've done videos on, and they do have their own look, whereas the A100 is a more muted tonal response. Of course, you have different settings that you can adjust with the JPEGs, but I can see some people not liking the output because it's perhaps not quite as interesting as the other two cameras that I looked at. On the other hand, you may prefer to have a more neutral starting position. Let's talk about a few issues or potential problems.
What sort of problems?
This particular camera has some problems with the steady shot. It's intermittent, it sort of buzzes and shakes around a bit. If you have one with a defective mechanism, you can also get misaligned images. Whilst I appreciate the extra functionality of the function dial, I do think that they should have put the ISO back over on the right hand side near the shutter release. That's a setting that you're much more likely to be changing, and I think it makes sense to have its own dedicated button for that. Never really understood why Sony removed the rubber thumb pad. You just don't have as much grip on the camera as you do with the 5D. The LCD does tend to smear quite easily. It's not particularly easy to keep clean, and the visibility outside isn't great. It doesn't get that bright even at the highest setting. Keep an eye out for the grip on this camera because it does tend to come away. That's probably because it's more of a harder material. It's not a huge problem as such. You can do a DIY repair on that and put it back into place, but sometimes the material can actually stretch, so you need to cut it down. As this was a sort of lower mid-level model, it was a bit strange that they didn't have a vertical grip option. We also have limited bracketing, 2/3 of a stop. There is a less common silver version out there if you want to have a look for that. I will be doing a comparison with the 5D and the A200 in a future video. The overall build quality on the Sony is pretty decent really. I don't have a problem with it. There are some pros and cons to all of these particular cameras. I don't think it was a bad first effort from Sony, though it didn't bring that much to the table other than a new sensor and a larger buffer. Most obvious drawback with the A100 is the subpar low light performance. If you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on the A100, do drop a comment down below. And as usual, thanks for watching.